Hey Bob, how are you?
Hello, Daniel. How are you?
Good. It seems like I just saw you yesterday. Oh wait, I did just see you yesterday.
Saw me yesterday in New York.
For the viewers of in the Sophia audience, I finally got to meet Bob for the first time in person, and
Lucky
I have to
you.
say he's even more interesting and impressive in person.
Charismatic.
I had no idea that you were so tall and formidable in your physical affect.
Yeah, well, it did get a little physical. It did. There were fisticuffs when you were wrong about something, and there was no. You were not amenable to logical argument.
So I guess today we're going to finish our discussion on Hume, and we left to today the stuff that's on reason and the passions, which for Hume connects directly to ethics. And there may be other things that you want to talk about having to do with Hume's theory of the self and so on and so forth. And you may want to make some connections that interest you. So why don't we just start? Why don't we do it the same way we did last time? Why don't you ask me some questions and we'll get into a conversation?
Yeah, not being a philosopher, I know fairly little about Hume, but I am a fan based on what I know. And we talked a little last time about how just clear he is in his writing, and I think in his reasoning, and how nice that is. But there are a couple of specific positions that I'm very drawn to of his.
Okay.
And one, and I think we might as well start out with this, and we'll probably spend much of the conversation on it. It's very famous. It's, as you said, it's about the reasons and the passions. We should say that passions isn't meant exactly the way it's meant today. With passions today, we mainly think of sexual passion, probably.
Yeah.
He meant the emotions broadly, and I would say even further, he meant affective responses to things generically.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And so when he says in this famous sentence, he's talking about the relationship between reason and between cognition, what is sometimes called cognition and affect, between reason and feelings or emotions. He says, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. He's a great writer.
Yes.
But one interesting thing here is he's saying two different things. He's saying reason is the slave of feelings. It serves them. And he's saying and ought only to be. And I honestly don't understand the ought only to be part. I don't understand what he's trying to get across here. And I'm going to turn to you later for enlightenment on that point.
Okay.
As for the descriptive part, reason is the slave of the passions. I think that's very consistent with what is coming out of modern psychology generally, in terms of even actual brain scan studies showing how closely affect and cognition are intertwined. But this is also very consistent with evolutionary psychology, just in a kind of a theoretical sense almost. It's also consistent, I should say, with my own introspection, especially when I do things like meditate. And this is not the only thing that I think is a little bit Buddhist of Hume. There's been a lot of discussion, maybe we'll have time to get to this, about how his skepticism about the existence of the self is very Buddhist. But that's a separate matter. So, I think his point is that, when it comes to actually motivating behavior, I think this is his point, there's got to be feelings involved, and in a way it boils down to feelings. So, imagine anything that you're employing reason to do. Like, say I'm researching some purchase. Like, I decide I need a new down jacket. I research it online. I come to a conclusion. I think Hume would say that, first of all, the reasoning begins in feeling, because wanting a jacket is a feeling. Now, it may in turn be informed by reason. You may reflect on the fact that you got colder than you'd like to be, but of course, being cold is colder than you'd like to be is a feeling. In any event, the desire to purchase something is a feeling that triggers a chain of research and reasoning. But then when you ultimately the desire to buy a specific coat is also a feeling, and it has been it has been informed by reason. So this little bit of reasoning has its beginning and its end in feeling, and at the end of the day, it's feeling that that motivates you to buy a jacket. So feeling tells reason what to think about, what research to do. And then in the end, I'm not sure Hume emphasized both of these things. I think modern psychology would emphasize both of these. And there are even interesting brain scan studies about purchasing decisions, where they do the brain scans on people, and they find they can predict pretty well what they're going to buy by just looking at the affective parts of the brain, whether they're the kind of approach and avoidance parts of the brain, you might say. So anyway, I'm not sure exactly how much emphasis Hume puts on these two aspects: the fact that feelings tell you what to reason about, and then at the other end, that the reasoning is kind of cashed out in the way of feeling, which then finally motivates the behavior. But I would say it's very consistent with modern psychology, and I can elaborate later maybe on why I say this is very much an evolutionarily psychological view as well. It's very consistent with modern psych in a theoretical sense. But first, why don't you react to what I've said?
So the stuff about reason and the passions actually comes is bundled together with other elements in which Hume is criticizing kind of rationalist morality or reason-based morality. And so because we're going to discuss these separately, and you haven't mentioned morality yet, I'm just going to separate this part of the critique out. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons why he thinks that rationalist or reason-based morality is faulty is precisely because reason, he thinks, doesn't move anything, right? All that reason can do is lead to a belief that such and such is the case, right? So the example that you gave with the code is a perfect example, right? So I might, on the basis of a scientific investigation, find out that a human being's body temperature needs to be kept at a certain temperature, and that therefore, if the external temperature falls below a certain point, then a human being, as a matter of fact, needs a coat, right? But unless I care about remaining warm or even about surviving, that belief in by itself is not going to lead me to do anything, right? It's causally inert in the sense of, and Hume thinks this about all matters of what he calls the understanding. That which belongs to the understanding has to do with what is true and false, right? But it does not, in and of itself, move us to do anything.
Right.
Now, the way this connects to ethics is because ethics, Hume thinks, is a fundamentally practical discipline. At the end of the day, it's supposed to be about why we do things, mm-hmm. right? And
about wanting one thing to happen.
Right, that's right.
That's what prescription is.
That's
when
right.
you say
That's
you should do this.
That's right. And it's worth mentioning that, Kant, who is very much a rationalist about morality, who very much thinks that morality is a result of reason, is the product of reason, has a notoriously terribly difficult time explaining why anyone should be moral, right? Kant can give you the categorical imperative, but as Philippa Foot pointed out in a very famous paper called Morality as a System of Hypothetical Imperatives, she said, unless one cared about being moral, there's no reason to follow the categorical imperative. In other words, it doesn't carry within it its own force, right? All the force, all the normative force comes from the emotions, from caring about these things, from things mattering to you, right? And so I think this is Hume's primary point here. And let me just say one last thing about it. In this sense, Hume, like a number of other modern philosophers, has a much narrower conception of reason than the ancient Greeks did. The ancient Greeks thought that reason was the much larger thing. It wasn't simply a calculating or an investigative modality. it was a way to sort of, it was a modality by which one could apprehend not just the ultimate nature of things, but the ultimate good of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so an ancient philosopher would never accept the separation of the separation between reason and emotion the way that Hume does. But that's simply a result of Hume being so influenced by the modern scientific revolution, right? And by a picture of the world in which reason has a much smaller and more purely instrumental role in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's turn to the ethics. Let me first say one more thing about why Hume's view makes sense descriptively, just as a description of human psychology and the way things actually work, is just that, so far as we can tell, I mean, of course, we can't say for sure that anybody other than, well, I can't say for sure that any being other than me has feelings, strictly speaking. I can't be anybody else, but we're all pretty sure other people have feelings. And in fact, most of us believe that other animals have feelings. It's probably easiest to believe that about other primates, but if you have dogs, you're pretty sure they have feelings and so on. Seems like a good bet that feelings have been with us for a long time in evolution. And what that suggests is that feelings came first, right? I mean, some people would say that feelings go all the way back to the very beginning. So if you see like a primordial bacterium that is drawn to certain things like sources of nutrition and shows an aversive behavior toward things like toxins, for all we know, some very elementary feeling is associated with those. But in any event, we know that we have good reason to believe that as a general matter, feelings come in two broad varieties, attraction and aversion, right? Like there's positive feelings and negative feelings, and we feel positive feelings toward those things that natural selection wanted us to be drawn to, like food and sex and social esteem, we feel aversion toward things that natural selection wanted us to avoid, like poisonous snakes, people who are going to kill us, and so on. Right. So the best guess is, look, long before there was anything like human reason in the animal kingdom, there were feelings. So they came first as the guides to behavior, and the cognition, in the sense of reasoning, is a pretty recent add-on. And the only reason it would get added on from a Darwinian point of view is if it served the interests that were already reflected in the feelings themselves, right? I mean, there's a value system implied in the feelings. It's natural selection's value system. It's like this, and this are good. Approach them. This, and this are bad. Or approach them or get more of them, or try to, pave the way to get them down the road or something. So there's a value system there. And that people operate, animals operate under. Squirrels think nuts are good. They think my dogs are bad because my dogs chase squirrels, and they presumably have those feelings. So if reason comes late, and it's a product of natural selection, then it stands to reason it too is going to serve natural selection's value system. And so it is going to be kind of an instrument that is ultimately in the service of those feelings that were already there reflecting that value system. And so there's just this theoretical sense in which what Hume is saying makes sense, right? So
I can't say right only because I'm not a fan of EdPsych, and I think it's I think it's excessively reductive, and I think it, we've discussed this before. There's no need to rehash it. As for what Hume would think of it, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he would be an enthusiast, only because he was very much an enthusiast for the science of his day. Mm-hmm. And he very much had the ambition to sort of advance a purely natural, a very thoroughly naturalistic account of human behavior. And so I'm sure he would be probably much more interested in contemporary EdPsych than I would be. I mean, this is where my orientation goes much more Wittgenstein and much less, tends to be more behavioristic, and less in this direction. But nothing. Let's put it this way. I mean, nothing that you've said in any way is inconsistent with what he says.
Mm-hmm.
But whether what I feel about it, stuff, obviously I get off the bus once we get to the psych. With regard to stuff like this, I get off the bus. But maybe in 50 years when it's more developed, I might change my mind if I'm still alive. But right now, a lot of it strikes me as sounding a lot like just so stories. That I'm always immediately suspicious of the minute I hear them. But that's not. I'm not meaning to start an argument about that because I don't want to derail us.
I refer anyone tempted to agree with you to. Well, let's see. Which book about evolutionary psychology should I? Oh, how about the one I wrote, The Moral Animal? For my own view on this, but I mean, it's an old book now, but the basic ideas are still at the center of evolutionary psychology. That is another conversation. But the point is just this is another reason Hume
that you find him interesting and
the descriptive part makes sense to me. Now, as for the prescriptive part, I mean, first of all, there's a little bit of irony in this phrase: reason is and ought only to be, because if it seems there that he's inferring from the fact that it is that it ought to be, well, it can't be that because he's famous in another context for distinguishing between ought and is and saying you can't infer ought from is.
Which we'll get to, yeah.
Yeah, and which, by the way, is a source of resistance to evolutionary psychology. You say, in fact, I have a little story about this that so perfectly illustrates the problem. When The Moral Animal was published, this is like in the 1990s, it was excerpted on the cover of Time magazine, which back in those days, was a great break.
Right.
But you couldn't pick the wording on the cover of Time magazine. If it's going to go out to there at that point, God knows how many millions of people, they get to decide the angle. And the piece was about kind of the, why monogamy is difficult. That's what it was. It was like lifelong monogamy is not natural, and this is why it's hard, and love fades, and so on. And the way they boiled that down on the cover was there was an image of a broken wedding ring, and it said, infidelity, it may be in our genes. And, in some sense that's true, although I didn't mean that unfaithful people are the ones who have the infidelity gene and the rest of us don't. I didn't mean that. I mean, it's in everyone's genes and so on. So anyway, I would go on the road. I went to this one talk show in Seattle where they had this whole audience assembled. It was one of these Oprah-type settings, except it was a local show. Live audience. And the producer comes in and the host is in there. We're just talking right before about what we're going to talk about. And it suddenly becomes evident to them that I don't believe infidelity is a good thing. They had inferred from the fact that I think it is the case that people incline to infidelity that we ought to commit infidelity. So this is exactly what Hume warns against. These guys were totally freaked out. They're like, well, I mean, we're 5 minutes from showtime. They're like, look, first let me say the last thing I'd ask you to do is misrepresent your views on TV. However, if it took a while for it to become clear that you actually don't believe infidelity is a good thing, that would really be really nice from our point of view. So anyway,
they were hoping that you would think it was a good thing?
Of course, because they had brought you know why?
So it would be a radical thesis,
because they had brought somebody on to debate that with me. There was like a Christian moralist who was going to explain to me why infidelity is not good.
Oh, that's brilliant. So
anyway, this is the life of the evolutionary psychologist. One of the main forms of sources of resistance. I'm not saying this is in your case, but is exactly
that's not my basis of resistance. Yeah,
but it's exactly what Hume warned against. The natural, what's come to be called the naturalistic fallacy, inferring ought from is. So he clearly doesn't mean that when he says reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. But I guess he sees some kind of connection, and this is the part where maybe you can help me out.
I think you don't want to take that too literally. I think what he's doing there is sort of what he's telling you is that you oughtn't think of reason in the older way, right? You oughtn't think of reason in the way that Plato and Augustine and others thought of it. That you ought to understand that reason is a relatively narrow faculty, and that it does not have the kind of preeminence, because you got to remember from antiquity all the way up until the Enlightenment, the notion that man is defined as a rational animal is firmly entrenched in the Western tradition, and also even gets bound up with the Christianization of ancient Greek philosophy. And so this is a very powerful paradigm, and even a lot of the thinkers of the Enlightenment believe it. So Hume, in this sense, is really quite radical. As a matter of fact, in that sense, he's really the only anti-rationalist when it comes to this level of rationalism in the Enlightenment. That is, believing that reason really can not only sort of, in a sense, function as an instrument, but as a way of determining our ends, right? Of determining what our ends are, and thus what we should do and what we should be. And so I think when you read that, really all that he's saying is that this is what reason is, right? And it's all that it ever was. Right? Yeah. And so you really, you gotta shed off. You ought to throw off this myth that philosophers have been peddling for now millennia, right? Suggesting that it's anything more.
So it's
than
like
a calculative faculty. Right?
So he's saying ethical philosophy, ethics by its nature involves preference. It involves wanting one thing to be the case rather than another. And maybe this is related. You said that Kant was trying to come up with a purely rational ethics. And one thing about Kant, okay, so the categorical imperative, to oversimplify it a bit, the basic idea is like do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or do unto others you would have everyone do to everyone, or something like that.
Yeah, it's not quite
right. I know. I said oversimplify, but this is the point I want to make, is that if you just read Kant, at least in the kind of cursory way that I did once, and it has some of the feeling of what's called a consequentialist argument. And a consequentialist ethics is where you judge the ethical principle by what the consequences are. So utilitarianism is consequentialist because you want to maximize happiness or whatever. And of course, that is not purely reasonable because it begins with a preference. You want happiness for people. I mean, you're
positing... Mill would not argue for it that way, though.
Well,
Mill made the case that happiness is the intrinsic good, and he makes a rational case for that.
Well, I've kind of made that case.
He does not give an emotive sort of argument.
Well, although part of his argument, as I recall, is, look, it's what everybody wants, right? I mean, it's like, he's citing a preference. He's citing an affective preference, and anyway, I have myself tried to, well, anyway, but the main thing I want to say is this, is like Kant Kant scholars will generally say, no, it sounds like a consequentialist argument to you, but at least some of them will argue that, no, that's a misunderstanding. It's not consequentialist.
It is a misunderstanding.
Okay, it may be, but I think I suspect the reason that it seems so consequentialist is because Kant is wrestling, and Hume would say futilely, with the challenge of coming up with an ethics that is purely reasonable, and in my view, purely reason-based, and in my view, a consequentialist ethics would not be, because it ultimately begins with a value judgment, a preference.
Right. I mean, let me just say one thing about Kant. I mean, one thing you have to remember is that the formulation of the categorical imperative that you gave, it's called the humanity formula. And actually, strictly speaking, what it says is one always ought to treat others as an ends rather than as a means to an end. It does not say treat others, that's the golden rule.
But wait, there's a formulation of it even by him that's close, that sounds more like the golden rule.
But the two most important formulations are the first two. And the first one is act only in such a way that you can will the maximum of your action to be a universal law.
That's the one I meant, yes.
And the whole point is supposed to be that all the other formulations are derivable from the first. Now, I couldn't...
Okay, but where does the first come from?
If you asked me to do it, I couldn't, right? But I know people that can. I mean, people who are...
No, but my question is, where does that first principle come from? Oh, is the first one about the ends and the means? Or which one?
The first one is about universalizability of maxims.
My question is, where does that... I think that's the one he can't get to.
That's the one that comes from all the stuff that's in the bulk of the groundwork.
Right.
About about really what Kant thinks is that obligation, that duty is a condition of rational personhood.
Uh-huh.
And this is tied in with his political liberalism. I mean, this is one of the most powerful arguments on behalf of political liberalism. And that is, one of the things about political liberalism is, why do people have intrinsic value, right? Because the whole idea of political liberalism is that the individual is sacrosanct in some sense. And Kant gives a very compelling idea, and that is that we are the makers of value because value is part of the condition of rational personhood, right? And so we are all creators of value, and we are thus all equally creators of value, and thus our inherent dignity is manifest and ought to be respected by in our actions and our institutions. Kant thinks there's also a very strong component of agency in this, right? So the reason why Kant wants to eschew any appeal to the emotions or the passions or even desires in the account of morals is because he thinks that when we act under the influence of the passions, we're acting under the influence of nature, not under the influence of our own will, right? We're actually not. He thinks we're acting most freely when we conform to the rule, not when we break it, right?
Conform to his
the
rule.
Moral rule, yeah. Right? I mean, most people would say, well, what is, people would define freedom as freedom from rules.
Right.
And Kant thinks that freedom is the result of self-legislation, right? That when we legislate the rule to ourselves and follow it is when we're most free.
Well, I agree. I mean,
but you don't agree about the stuff about the passions and
well, I agree that freedom. I mean, I agree that a common misconception or a use of freedom that I don't subscribe to is freedom consists in doing what you want. Freedom consists in following your feelings. I think it's the opposite. I think freedom consists in reflecting on your feelings and, of course, Hume would at this point say, how are you going to finish that sentence, Bob? Reflecting on your feelings and what? And then deciding to do what they're not urging you? Well, fine. But ultimately, that decision is going to have a feeling associated with it.
That's just another urge, right?
And that's true. But even Hume, I think, distinguishes between the violent passions and the calmer passions. He has feeling like, so aesthetic appreciation to him has higher value, like contemplating the beauty of something has higher value than raping and pillaging in accordance with your feelings.
Yes, he does. And that has to do with whether the passion that's involved is calm or excited. Mm-hmm. And that does, I mean, in the treatise, he has an entire book devoted just to the passions before he even gets to the ethics. In the Enquiry, he removes that extra book on the passions. He collapses all of that material into the ethical treatise and to the ethical part of the Enquiries. But look, I mean, his two main things about reason and passion is one, reason cannot move us. Only passion can, and since ethics is a practical discipline, it's got to be governed by passion and not by reason. And the second has to do with the fact that values are not objective features of the world. They're subjective qualities. Right. He gives the same treatment of values as he gives of secondary qualities like color and smell and taste, and as he gives of aesthetic properties like beauty. They are in the mind of the perceiver. Right. They are not objective features of the world.
That's a very Darwinian view. That's a very Evsite view.
And that's just a very scientific view, period, right? I mean, the notion that values are part of the furniture of the objective world is what J.L. Mackie, who's a contemporary moral anti-realist, would call a weird metaphysics, right? Because think about this. To say that something is valuable is to say that it matters. But to say that something matters without it mattering to someone is a very weird thing to say. What does it mean to say that something matters independently of mattering to someone, right? And so I think if you have anything like a scientific view of the world, there's a presumption against the notion of values being objective, right? They're not like rocks, right?
There may be.
If there's no creatures in the universe to whom things matter, it's weird to say that that's a universe that has value in it. That's why most of the older objective views of value depend on God, right? Because even if there are no creatures in the universe to whom things matter, things still matter to God, and so value still exists. But if there's nothing in the universe to which things matter, which is the condition the universe was in 1 billion years ago, right? it's very weird to talk about there being values in it.
So in other words, to say that things matter is to say that they matter to a being.
Right. Mattering is a two-place predicate, is the way I would put it.
Right. Yeah, well, you can get there that way, but when I say it's Darwinian, I mean, I think Darwinism adds flesh to the argument in the following sense. I mean, first of all, there are lots of people, including philosophers, who consider themselves very scientific in orientation, but they will argue about something like art as if one of them's right. You know what I mean? I mean, as if there really is a right, objectively right view, and that's, you just said, is probably not a very scientific way to look at it. So it happens, and I think the way the Darwinian, I don't want to say narrative, but let's say narrative. It is an account of how life came to be where it is. I think the way that adds flesh is with examples like this. Well, one example is aesthetics, but let's take one that's closer to ethical philosophy, like the intuition we all have that good deeds should be punished, good deeds should be rewarded, and bad deeds should be punished. And it's a when you examine it, it's not like a crude. It doesn't feel like a crude feeling when you think, justice has been done because that person who did that horrible thing to that woman has been caught and put in jail, or has been killed, or whatever, or that guy who did that wonderful altruistic thing won the lottery the next day. It's a feeling that, it's a kind of a feeling that you are in touch with the moral truth. I mean, most people would say it's a commonly held moral intuition that this is the case. Now, I think you would say that you can argue in an abstract sense that, well, no, this is a value. And the value must originate with the human being. It's not like a value that's out there in the universe somewhere. It must originate with the human being. Evolutionary Darwinism now has a very plausible account of how this intuition evolved. It has a lot of detail and some empirical support about how
having to do with social animals and other.
Yeah.
Which is why you see proto-moral behavior in primates and things like that.
Right. It was a practically useful intuition in a social context of punishment and reward.
Right.
And so
for creatures that have a certain degree, how should we say, of sophistication and agency, because I can point to the most social creatures in the world that clearly have no ethics at all, and that's insects, right? And so.
Well, what do you mean when you say they clearly have no ethics at all?
Well, I think to speak of an ant having values is just, is almost ungrammatical.
They behave altruistically, but.
Yeah, but that's an anthropomorphism, right? I mean, that's not.
Well, no, there is a rigorous definition. I mean, altruism is something that is done that benefits another organism in the sense of at your expense, in the sense of increasing your chances of dying or something.
Yeah, but when the ordinary use of altruistic implies that the person, it's done intentionally.
Motivation. It's often. Right.
It has to do with your motivation, right? But no, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying it's not just the social animal part. It's also a certain level of mental sophistication, right?
Sure.
I mean, yeah.
And more specifically, the fact that we evolved in a context where people didn't just do things, they argued about them. Yeah. There were societies where people said, wait, why did I hit him? Here's why I hit him. And and it helped them to have a heartfelt rationale for why it was right to hit him. So ethical, what you could call ethical discourse, we believe, has been going on for a long time, including during the evolution of the brain itself, and it's the fact that we evolved. Chimpanzees do in fact punish bad behavior and reward good behavior when it's done to them.
That's right.
But and there are people like Franz de Waal who have argued that they see signs of the beginning, the rudiments of the kind of sense of justice in our sense of the term, of believing that it's good that good deeds be rewarded. But by and large, I think to get a finely articulated version of this moral intuition, you have to evolve in a context of language where defending your interests linguistically and defending things that are good for you and your kin and your group or whatever actually has Darwinian value.
Yeah, certainly the full-blown version of it.
Right.
seem to require language capacity. But, primates have a rudimentary version of that as well. And so, you'd expect this to be kind of like on a spectrum. But let me just push a little bit on the notion. Look, it is true that Hume thinks that moral values are subjective in the sense that they are perceiver dependent, right, or valuer dependent. Mm-hmm. But he also believes that there is normativity, that there are oughts, that there are moral oughts.
Okay, so how does he get there?
Okay, so let me explain how he gets there. And this is a common strategy, again, that he employs across the various subjective properties. So let me start with a very easy case. So in the case of color perception, if you tell me that a stop sign is blue, there's a very straightforward sense in which I can say not only that you were wrong, but that you ought to see it as red. And the sense of ought there that's at work is in terms of what we would call a competent perceiver or a competent judge, right? The reason why you're seeing blue is because you are in some way physiologically defective, right? And this doesn't have any sort of moral connotation. This is simply a statistical judgment. If most people saw stop signs as blue, that would be the norm, right? So I don't want to get anybody to get all worked up about this, that I'm, saying that people with disabilities are defective in some moral sense. In a purely statistical sense, otherwise we wouldn't call it a disability, all right? Hume thinks that this can be carried over. So in the case of aesthetic value, Hume has a paper called Of the Standard of Taste, which I just taught in my aesthetics class. And what Hume says there is that beauty is a subjective property, but that there are better and worse judges of beauty. Now, such that we can judge, so if someone was to say, Britney Spears is better than Mozart, Hume would say, there's a very straightforward sense in which that's wrong, and in which we could say to them, you ought to think that Mozart is better than Britney Spears, and the ground on which you ought to think that is what a competent judge of music would say, okay? And Hume's account of competence in the case of aesthetics is roughly by appeal to certain credentials, experience, sensitivity, da-da-da-da. Whether you accept it or not, whatever. I'm just telling you the form of this reply. With regard to ethics, it's a lot more like the answer with respect to color perception. Hume thinks that there is a human nature, right? He thinks that the normal human being is fundamentally sympathetic. This he shares with a lot of the other Scottish moralists.
Fundamentally sympathetic, meaning?
That our natural instinct is one of sympathy to others, right? Now that sympathy diminishes as the other is farther and farther away from us, both in relation and in space and time, right? So I naturally am going to care more about my sister than about a total stranger. I'm naturally going to care more about somebody right in front of me than somebody on the other side of the planet.
The way it actually works is sympathy also diminishes to the extent that someone has a conflicting interest with yours. If it's your rival for a mate or something, you're not very sympathetic.
But notice that those are all types of distance from you.
Okay.
Right? Those are all types of distance from you. But Hume, like many of the Scottish moralists, and I'm thinking of Hutcheson in particular, generally think that human nature normally is sympathetic and benevolent. And so for Hume, somebody who has malicious sentiments and engages in malicious behavior, yes, good and bad are subjective properties, right? But we can still say that they're wrong and that they ought to act otherwise because we can appeal to what a normal human being would do.
So they're not conforming to human nature when they do
That's
that.
Right.
Well, here evolutionary psychology would say he's just flat out wrong. We are, in fact, designed to be antagonistic to people depending on how we consciously or unconsciously perceive them in relation to our interests.
But I did not say that his account of normativity in ethics is compelling. I'm just simply saying look, if a characteristic is subjective, then the only way you can preserve normativity is by some account of competent judge, right? That's the only way, because you can't point to an objective fact, because there is none, right? So the only thing you could say is that someone is a better or worse judger of something. If you want to preserve that ought, that ability to use the ought. Now, to the extent to which Hume is wrong about human nature, that option is lost to him, And he doesn't have then a compelling account of normativity in
Yeah.
ethics. I just simply wanted to say he does not, his subjectivism does not lead to a anti-normativism, right?
Yeah, that's a little bit ironic to me. I wonder if he was, he was very bold in being basically an atheist in his time, and maybe it was just going a little too far.
We're not sure about whether he was an atheist or a deist. It's not entirely
okay.
known.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, that's another interesting thing about, we should get to the question of design that he touched on a little. I just discovered by, doing my little quick online research on him. But I wonder, I mean, it does seem to me like he's kind of straining against the point he himself has made about reason and the passions when he asserts that, yes, we can preserve notions of moral value. And I just wonder if he had lived at a time when utilitarianism were better developed. I don't know what stage it was in. I mean, Bentham hadn't even started, Bentham's father wasn't even around, right? So if he had lived at the end of the 19th century, I wonder if he would have found, consequentialism and more specifically utilitarianism kind of appeal. It seems to me a more natural fit.
Well, substantively, he is sometimes called a utilitarian.
Yeah, well, that seems natural to me.
Substantively, his views align with the utilitarians.
Yeah.
But the arguments are not done in that way. The value theory is not done in that way. But the substance of what the ethics consists of is, roughly speaking, utilitarian, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. The thing I was just going to say about design, I came across a thing where he said, there were, in the century in which he lived, arguments for God from design. Some were famous. I mean, this is when William Paley wrote his work on natural theology, I think, and, famously said, look, organisms are different from rocks. I mean, organisms are more like pocket watches in terms of intricacy, function, and we know that pocket watches have a designer, so organisms must have. Hume did not contest that, which is actually, interestingly, even Richard Dawkins doesn't contest that. I mean, Dawkins says, animals were designed just not by God. They were designed by natural selection. And Hume, in a way, says something kind of analogous. He says, okay, it's one thing to infer design, but you have to be careful in what you can infer about the designer.
Right.
So, so even if you accept that, okay, an animal must have been designed by something pretty smart, that doesn't mean we're talking about the God of Christianity or something, and that which was the kind of step that Paley wanted to take.
Well, look, the design arguments never ever got you beyond anything like a rudimentary deism. I mean that's the reason why. I think in every single debate I ever saw Hitchens do with theists, he would always sort of, especially with William Lane Craig, who would constantly trot out these cosmological arguments, Hitchens would always say, great, even if I grant you all of that, all your work is still ahead of you, right? Because that doesn't get you even close to some anthropomorphic giant man in the sky who talked to the Hebrews and, sent his son down to get crucified and all of that. The notion that, and in that sense, the medieval theologians, I think, were a lot smarter than the contemporary ones. I mean, Thomas Aquinas knew perfectly well that by itself didn't get you Jesus of Nazareth, right? And all of the rest. And even Anselm, much earlier, I think, probably wouldn't have fallen prey to that sort of mistake. Right. I'm probably not even as inclined as Dawkins to even subscribe design, even in the minimal sense. But you and I have argued about that also. So that's
that's a question of language.
No reason to bore people with that again.
No, I mean it's a question. I just think it's a question of language. I mean, natural selection, clearly, the creative process of natural selection is very different from the creative process that created a rock, and it leads to this sort of functional integration and teleological behavior on the part of the organisms, goal-seeking behavior on the part of the organisms that in other contexts we do associate with design. But whether you want to use the term, as some people do, or use it in quotes or whatever, that doesn't really
it doesn't matter that much
to me.
You're not employing it to make theistic arguments. And so...
Well, no, I do. One thing I do think is and this is what's it's interesting. I mean, I do think that natural selection itself, if you just look at the entire history of evolution on this planet, I think we've talked about this, it has, if you just step back, if you can extract yourself enough to really look at what it would look like to just observe natural selection in time lapse, if you didn't know anything about it, you just saw it proceed on this planet, and all of a sudden you're where we are. I mean, first it triggers cultural evolution in humans. You get to where we are. You just start this planetary brain seems to be emerging in the form of the internet. I think an observer would go, "Whoa, that's kind of A, it's amazing. B, it's kind of like it has something in common with the way an organism develops." So I think you could believe that natural selection, and again, I mean natural selection, nothing spooky, not intelligent design, just nuts and bolts natural selection, you could argue that may have been set in motion in some sense to reach a goal, achieve a purpose. And so in that sense, there may be purpose. Now, what's interesting here is, as you note, that doesn't mean that doesn't get you an interventionist God. In fact, I mean, it might get you a deistic God. The truth is, it doesn't even necessarily get you that. I won't elaborate. But what's interesting to me is, even though granting, hypothetically, some sort of purpose to natural selection doesn't get you any very precise place theologically, it totally freaks almost everyone out who consider in the modern kind of scientific community. They just don't want to hear it. And they refuse to entertain. They refuse to listen. They literally refuse to listen to the argument.
Right, because they immediately leap to the theistic conclusion, and they assume that that's what this is about. And, I mean, my reaction to it is very different. I mean, to me, these are, in a sense, what we talked about last time, Didion-esque stories. Yeah. To me, the key is when you say, if an observer, and what I would want to say, an observer like us were to look at this, they would say, oh, wow, this is really... But to me, that says everything about the observer and nothing at all about the thing being observed.
Well, okay,
but that's our difference. I mean, that's the...
Okay, but I would just point out that the argument I'm making, the logic of that argument, is the logic held by Dawkins in the book The Blind Watchmaker. He doesn't apply it to natural selection, but it's exactly the same logic, and he's exactly the kind of person who would be totally freaked out if you took his own logic and just changed the context. And I'm just saying that a lot of people who now make a living by preaching the virtues of reason and dismissing religious people as irrational themselves, when they sense some argument is threatening, are just as irrational and closed-minded.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I loved on the old Meaning of Life site, the original one, you got Dan Dennett to admit this.
Well, he says he didn't, but I won't get into that.
He explicitly admitted it. I watched.
Well, my view is what he said adds up to an admission.
On video.
Yeah, no, I think. I mean, he just twisted him in the ensuing email exchange, which is online. You can find it.
He twisted himself.
He just twisted himself in knots. It just made no sense what he was saying. Once I pointed out to him that what he said was tantamount to acknowledging that there is at least some evidence that evolution has purpose, he totally freaked out. He heard from his flock of admirers that he had committed heresy, and the ensuing email exchange, and there will be commenters who scream at me for being a jerk. Go read the damn thing. Read it carefully.
I read it.
It makes no sense.
And I'm not friendly to your view on this.
I know.
I read it, and I watched it, and he said yes. When you flat out asked him. And he said yes. In that sense, he said yes.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of... I mean, you have to... He said yes to two things, and I didn't do a good enough job in the interview of saying, you realize what this adds up to. But anyway, that's all laid out. If you go... We can link to that, and we can link to the email exchange. The
worst thing that ever happened to Dennett was becoming a public intellectual. That was the worst thing, and especially becoming one of the four horsemen. In my opinion, he hasn't written a really good book since Brainstorms. But in
his defense, I'll say he does not have some of the properties of the other four horsemen that drive
he's not as obnoxious because he's still too classy of a guy, and too much of an intellectual to go that far.
And he understands that even if you consider, like as many people naturally do, like freelance jihadism a big problem. He understands that probably going around saying, don't you Muslims understand that God doesn't exist, is not a very productive... That's not the way to solve the problem.
So listen, you want to do quickly on the self, because
Yeah,
that was
just
something
quickly. I
yeah.
just want to quote a little Hume. Now, this is not. This has been noted by other people, and in fact, in Buddhism there is this doctrine of the self doesn't exist. And Hume says, I will read quotes from Hume. Something sounds just remarkably not just like the assertion that self doesn't exist, but the very logic of it is just so Buddhist. And this led, Alison Gopnik, who I guess is a philosopher, is she at Berkeley or something? Do you know that name?
Say it again?
Alison Gopnik.
Don't know. Gopnik.
Gopnik.
Yes.
And she wrote, she got really interested in this and went and researched the possibility. She wrote about this in the Atlantic and has maybe written about it subsequently. The possibility that maybe Hume had contact with Buddhist texts. And she actually made the case that in a library,
He was a librarian in Edinburgh. I would think that, he certainly would have had access.
I think she established that in some library Hume had access to, there was a work that had been either done or brought to England by a Jesuit, brought to Britain by a Jesuit, had stuff that Hume could have been exposed to. It's totally conjectural, but anyway, here's what Hume says. There's two things, a couple of parts of the Buddhist argument. One is that the self does not remain continuous through time. I am very different from the me I was when I was 12 and even from the me I was yesterday. There's nothing that persists forever. And Hume says, quote, if any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. In other words, since self is supposed to be some essence that supposedly preserves forever. Right. And then he writes, but there is no impression constant and variable. He's talking about perceptions and so on. There is no impression constant and variable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. It can never, therefore, be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived. And consequently, there is no such idea. Then he also says, another way the Buddhists break it down is like at any given moment, if you look at the thing you call yourself, it just consists of a bunch of different things going on.
Hume calls a bundle of perceptions.
Right. He writes, for my part, when I enter most intimately in what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception and never can observe anything but the perception. Then later he says, these perceptions and other things. Well, he says people in general are, quote, they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. And, part of the meditative practice is like apprehending that and getting enough removed from your normal state of mind that that's actually the way it looks to you. So anyway, he gets a lot of credit for this. If we had more time, I would argue that, whether he's right or wrong, he gets credit because there's a whole, a whole significant Eastern philosophy, plausibly at least, making a comparable argument. And for Hume, it was just another week of work to come up with.
The Eastern thinkers that you're talking about, they make a lot of that. In other words, that then becomes a basis for which to do a lot of work. For Hume, this is just one of the things he's skeptical about, right?
He is a thoroughgoing skeptic.
That's right. And look, I always thought the idea of a self as a thing was very odd. Just as I have always thought that the notion of a mind as a thing is very odd. There's even a connection you could say in a small way to the existentialists. So I'm thinking something like Sartre's Transcendence of the Ego, where Sartre says that the self is posterior to consciousness, not prior to it, right? That the self is a kind of a summary or a summation of this bundle. And I think in that sense, the best version you're going to give of it is something like John Locke's, right? That self, that personhood or selfhood, is the result of a certain continuity of consciousness over time, right? That which one could at least in principle remember. That train is the arc of yourself. But Locke famously is completely agnostic about whether that indicates any sort of substance or whether that indicates any sort of non-physical entity, as Descartes thought it did. And I think that the inclination towards this sort of thinking is partly an artifact of language, that we have the word I, right? And the word you. And also is an artifact of a very old way of thinking that goes all the way back to ancient philosophy, that attributes have to inhere in substances, right? Right? That you can't have characteristics without a kind of a bin for them to sit in, right? And I think that it also has a heritage in that, right?
But I think to attribute self to some series of philosophical development, the notion that there is a self to some series of philosophical development.
Not that there's a self, but that it's a thing, that it's a.
Well, okay, but this is just an intuition of human beings. People have never heard of philosophy, and people living 2,000. I mean, if you take the average person and try to explain to them the Buddhist doctrine of non-self, they say, "Are you crazy? Of course I exist. Of course there's this thing that's me." It seems to be a deeply held human intuition.
These are modern people. We can't ask people from 10,000 years ago what they thought about the self. We have no idea. And actually, there's a pretty strong view that you find in several disciplines, that the notion of the self as an enduring, individual, discrete subject is a quintessentially modern notion, that you don't even have it in antiquity, really.
Right.
And so I'm not so sure that if you ask somebody,
but I will say that
5,000 years ago, if they would answer that way.
Well, but we have plenty of accounts of anthropologists who happen upon societies that are not literate, and hunter-gatherer societies that had little, or in some cases no, so far as we know, Western contact or contact with more technologically advanced societies. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know of like a work that devoted to this particular point. But you can bet these people say things like, "Well, I did this when I was 12, and you are to blame for this thing you did 10 years ago."
Right, but that doesn't tell us anything about how
but it tells you
understand that.
But the fact that is, I think, a deeply human tendency, and a lot of this, I think, you can argue for in terms of evolutionary psychology. Why do we have certain intuitions about the self and a strong sense of volition and so on? I think a lot of it, you can argue that conception of the, quote, self is itself an adaptation. But in any event, I'm saying if you ask why is the notion of a self appealing when people state it as an abstract proposition, I think it's because it's deeply a part of human nature to be talking like that and thinking like that from the beginning about yourself and about others.
That I'd have to express some skepticism about, because I'm not sure that we correctly interpret what people that things say in antiquity. I don't know that I think that we don't interpret them very much through a modern lens. I don't know that that's how they understood it. I think that the knowledge we have of those times is very sketchy, precisely because even history wasn't done then in the way that we do it now. And I'm very dubious of anthropological efforts to use contemporary so-called primitives to make inferences about prehistoric.
Well, these are certainly people who have not been influenced by Western philosophy.
Oh no, absolutely, yeah. No, that's.
I mean, when they happened upon the Polynesians, they were not people who had been influenced by Plato's lineage.
But even the translations of the languages, if you know anything about the difficulties and problems in translation, are wildly overstated when they're transmitted in the popular sort of media. So I'd be very cautious.
But of course, in addition to that, I mean, I naturally talk about this, observed hunter-gatherer societies. Polynesians weren't; they were agrarian. But anyway, observed, kind of non-literate societies, because figuring out what the environment of hunter-gatherers, the hunter-gatherer environment might have been like 30,000 years ago is important to evolutionary psychology. You kind of do the best you can. You look at the examples you have. But for purposes of our argument, this discussion right now, I think it's enough to go look at pre-Platonic, pre-Greek, literature in the Middle East, where, Hammurabi probably, I would guess, boasts about various things that he did, and I think
but that does not mean that he understands what he is in the same way that a modern Cartesian does,
no,
right?
Not exactly, but and I'm not talking about the mind-body problem. I'm talking about a strong sense of identity and responsibility for your identity.
Of an enduring, underlying, existing separate substance, subject of experience that's distinct from the experiences. I don't know that
well, no, I'm not saying anybody put it like that, but I'm saying
that's what we mean.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you find things that I suspect there is evidence of back there, such as you are responsible, you deserve to die for something you did 5 years ago, and so on. If you even find this intuition of continuity of moral responsibility, well, right there, that's naturally suggests some sense of enduring essence, right?
Maybe, although I have to say that a lot of the responsibility was corporate. You didn't only deserve to die, your kids deserve to die, your wife deserved to die, your holdings deserve to be destroyed. I mean, whole generations deserve to go. I mean, I don't know that I think that you can make those kinds of straightforward inferences from the fact that people spoke the language of responsibility as we interpret it, that they understood, therefore they believed in an enduring subject of experience in the way that we think of it.
That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the way we naturally think about identity and volition and responsibility and so on. I'm saying, and I don't have time to flesh this part out. I mean, I do this in a book of mine that's going to come out in about 9 months or something on Buddhism, but well,
we'll have to do a show on that then.
Yeah, I'm sure people feel they can wait for that. But I'm just saying that the kinds of intuitions that I think are built into humans by natural selection about responsibility and identity and volition and so on are very conducive to the eventual philosophical articulation of a notion of self.
Maybe. Look, I can't categorically disagree with you. You and I have a very. You are much more inclined to look to evolutionary accounts, and I am much more cautious because I am much more inclined to ascribe things to irreducible dimensions of culture, and so that's just a difference that's so fundamental that we would have to really have like a very deep methodological.
Culture's important to me because remember, I believe in a universal human nature, and yet you look around and different places are very different in their customs and so on. So there's a lot of, if you believe in a universal human nature, as I do, and yet concede the obvious variation in human custom and experience and law and so on, you have to believe culture matters. So I do.
Yeah, you do. And you and if you, as you want to give evolution a very prominent role in explaining those kinds of things, then you have to be able to sort of talk about the evolutionary grounds of culture, which is what you try to do.
Right.
I just think at the current point, it's very, very sketchy, has a very big danger, I'm not accusing you of this, but a danger of being glib and falling into just so stories. And so I'm not seeing yet anything. I'm not seeing stuff there that compels me to sort of move away from my very anti-reductionist stance on this. But that doesn't mean it couldn't change. I mean, it certainly could.
No, we agree that there is hope for you. So
well, at least somebody thinks so.
We end on a note of concord. You're not irredeemably confused.
Irredeemably hopeless, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Bob.
Yeah, this was fun. We could have gone in a lot of directions.
We covered a lot of stuff. We got through some good Hume, and I think people got a good sense of it, and we managed to tie it to a lot of other things that are interesting. So so stay tuned. We'll probably do another philosopher sometime that you're interested in at some point.
Could well happen. Thank you, Dan. We'll see you.
Thank you, Bob. Take care.
Okay.